All right, this week we're reading chapter 18 in the America book. Just to go over a few themes that you should be looking for as you're doing your reading, I want to make sure that there are a couple things that you're looking for. One of those, as people moved across out of Reconstruction, really, as Reconstruction was happening, and as we get this transition, you get a lot of people who leave the South and the East to really avoid debt or to get out of debt. You have homestead acts that happen, that people are starting to move west and to start taking up residence on the frontier. We're going to see next week that the frontier is closing, and you're getting a lot of population out in the west. I've got a supplemental reading this week for you that really talks about that people are taking the East, the culture of the East, and taking it to the West, and that the West is really becoming a new East. And that's something for you to decide as you read this week. However, what I want you to see is that as people move west, whether they're trying to get away from debt or they're trying to start a new life just out of slavery, and so you have African Americans that are trying to gain more freedom, that we're seeing that labor is changing. Okay, that's one of the things that you should be seeing here, is that as we start getting slaves becoming freedmen or becoming free themselves, and they're moving to the West, that now you're seeing labor change. You're seeing more women becoming involved in labor. You're seeing more children, some as young as 8 years old, working 12 to 14-hour days in fields throughout the South, in factories in the East. But now you're getting more businesses and industry really rising up in the Midwest, around St. Louis, in Chicago, some of those places. Okay, and so I want to make sure that you understand that really one of the things that we need to be looking for in this chapter is labor and the changing of labor. As the Transcontinental Railroad is connected in Utah in this chapter, you're going to see that a lot of white men try to go out and to get jobs. However, they expect to be paid better than they were getting paid. And so a lot of these railroad tycoons started employing immigrants, mostly Chinese immigrants. And these Chinese immigrants would take lesser pay, which then led white men to be frustrated with them and really became agitated with immigrants as a whole, rather than seeing it as the railroad tycoons not paying enough or paying white labor or whatever it might be. They got frustrated with Chinese immigrants. Okay, this led to a lot of different issues. You had an Irish encampment in Montana that created a massacre of Chinese laborers of a Chinese camp there. You've got Chinese miners who were massacred in the northern panhandle of Idaho. And then on top of that, we don't really know the story. I've done some research on 6 graves that are out in Bliss that are of Chinese miners there. And there's 2 different stories. One that they were using dynamite to blow up the rock there and were killed by that. Or some that there's a story that frustrated white railroad workers came in and killed those Chinese workers as well. And so, I mean, we see this all over the West. We see it throughout time, that as white men are seen like they might, that immigration might be infringing on their labor, that they're frustrated, and instead of the backlash going towards those who are hiring immigrants, they get mad at the immigrants themselves. So take a look at that. That's also in this chapter as well. We see a lot of this as we move through in this chapter, the rise of labor and who is working it, but also then the rise of labor unions. There had been unions in other parts of the world up until this point, but really not a lot in the United States, and we get the rise of labor unions during this time period. That's another thing to be looking for. As a supplemental reading this week, it's called The Far East in the Far West. This should be something that you take a look at and are able to read really for the idea that we're getting urbanized we're urbanizing the West, the Midwest especially, but also out in places like San Francisco, Portland, Seattle, down to San Diego. These places are becoming bigger hubs, and as we see the two sides of the country are urbanized, more people are getting out of those urban areas and moving into rural areas to do the farming so that they can really take that food production back. This is an interesting thought, and one that William Cronin in Nature's Metropolis talks about, is this idea of an urban center growing up, and then in order to feed that urban center, the periphery grows so that the farming outside of that area can sustain the life inside that urban area. We're going to see that as time goes by, and in next week's chapter, really going to see the urbanization of the West, and see Frederick Jackson Turner saying that the frontier is closed completely, that there is no more space that is a frontier, that nowhere else that we need to go on the American continent, or at least the United States continent. Okay. Hopefully you've seen all of this kind of coming to a culmination in this idea that the frontier is closed, that now we've urbanized all of these spaces, and on top of that, that as we try to find cheaper labor, that now we're starting to get a class of people, or a subsection of the people, who are frustrated with the immigration policies that the United States has enacted, and that's going to lead to immigration policies that exclude some people as we continue on, specifically anti-Chinese immigration. We're seeing a lot of that today in Muslim immigration, but also in Syrian immigration, in Middle East immigration. It's very similar. And as we move through these chapters, I hope that you see that connection. That's really my thought, is that as we look at these themes, that you can see themes that correlate with today. And so look at those themes. The assignment as we work through this week will be a discussion post on week 2 that will really bring together this reading and the reading the far east and the far west. Hopefully you'll see those connections, and as we talk about the discussion for this week, you can see the ideas and the themes that we can bring together, and then try to find a way that you can use the examples from the book and the supplemental reading to prove the point that you're trying to make in the discussion. I hope you have a great week, and we'll see you next week. Thanks.